members of the planning and zoning staff, as well as our consultant, William Grimes. I don't know if you go by Bill. Hi.
And Nikita from the Planning Commission just joined. So
thank you. And Planning Commissioner Barkley is also in attendance. So we'll move right into general business action items, and that's this land use scenario planning exercise. And I'll go ahead and hand it over to Planning and Zoning Director John Gunther to get us started. Thanks, John.
Okay, thank you, Gabe. So we have I'm not sure, can you see that okay? Is that coming up? Hopefully that's coming up okay. So as it says in the agenda, we do have a fairly action-packed exercise we're going to embark on, and we think it should be very constructive for both commissions. We appreciate your time. It's not easy putting these things together and taking time out of your day to do this. We think it's really worthwhile to engage the commissioners as you make decisions together and collectively, and not that you make decisions together, but at least thinking about how that dynamic works. This is a second in a series of workshops we've done on land use planning. And so it's not going to be the last one, we don't think, but it's really a fundamental watershed for us because it really starts to think about what scenario planning is and those options and constraints that are there and what is realistic looking forward. And that's really taking a good dose of reality and thinking through those individually and then collectively. We're not going to get all of that done today. One of the major outcomes will be to understand the exercise, to understand scenario planning. There's a couple of tools that have been, which Bill will touch on again too, which we have loaded. I've sent some of those as links on Google Docs, and Grand County Connects has these as well. So you can go and take a look at a PowerPoint presentation where Bill almost does a 20th Century Fox presentation on land use planning, which is so dynamic. I don't know why I wouldn't be nominated for an Academy Award because that's coming up. So that's there. There's a PowerPoint presentation that's going to be coming as well, which Bill's going to go through, and then he's going to take a look at the worksheet, and that's there for all of you to take a look at. So a number of outcomes that we are looking at is trying to tie land use planning, good long-range land use with levels of service with the land use code. I realize in the state of Utah, that's a bit of an anomaly, is having that consistency between the land use code and the general plan, but there are tools that we can use within the land use code to connect those consistently, so that's there. And good long-range land use planning ties in to a good zoning regime as well, as it does for servicing as well. So even though we're small as a county, we have a lot of complications, and that's a good thing in planning. So that's we're going to be talking about that. And what I wanted to do first, though, besides the introduction, is there any questions about what's coming up here, or any questions about the format? You can always ask those later too. No, okay. No, just there was a pregnant pause. That's all. Got 5 seconds. So there's the land use analysis. We've got a number of general planning processes going on right now. We're hoping to embark on neighborhood planning starting in April. I know this has slipped a bit from our original commitment back summer, which was December, which went then to March, and now it's into April. Primarily, I'm going to blame COVID for part of this, because we were hoping to do something on Thursday, but that actually is piggybacking on the transportation track meeting, which is on Thursday too. So there's a bit of other planning going on which we're trying to coordinate. So that's one of the reasons we're now into April. You'll see in the bottom of the list for adoption. And that's ambitious, following a timeline too. Unified Transportation Master Plan's underway. The TAC meeting, Technical Advisory Committee meeting, is on Thursday this week. That'll help a lot. The project list has started. There's a draft report that's done, which the County Commission will eventually see. The Economic Development Master Plan is in the 2022 budget. That'll be starting soon with August and Ben leading that. Impact fee and capital project analysis, I think that's with Chris. That would be starting later, I'm guessing. I'm not sure where that's at, but that's coming. And then our public engagement master plan, working on that internally. We really believe that that's an internal document we don't want to give to a consultant. We'd rather get that done and build that cultural capital and social capital internally for the county to tap into. And then the phase 2 development of the general plan will be the neighborhood planning process, which will take the rest of the year and probably into next year for that update to the general plan. As these plans are developed, the transportation plan will update the general plan, the land use plan will update the general plan, public engagement will, neighborhood planning will, the impact fee analysis will, and so will the economic development master plan. And by the time we get to 2 years or a year and a half down the road, we'll have a truly functional general plan connected with the other regulation documents. That's the hope. So there's a bit of a timetable there. You'll see November 10th, we had a public open house with transportation at that time. That was more superficial for land use planning, but it was just touchstone. We did a draft general plan November 19th. Sounds like dark ages right now as far as so far long ago, but that was released back then. I'm redrafting a lot of that now and have what I consider to be a penultimate draft just about done. And then I'll skip a couple of dates here. We're right in the January 10th to 25th area. The County Commission agreed and Planning Commission to move ahead with this public outreach part of this and the workshops with a goal to get that done by February the 25th. The staff review of the strategic plan is going to happen this Friday, second review. So we're looking at the strategic plan that's running along with this as well. And then March 3rd is our public open house, and it's called Star Court by some people, and by other people it's called, what's the other name, Emily, that came up last night? There's another name that was
I can't remember the other name, but I didn't know that Star Court was the court.
Sun Court. It's called Sun Court.
Sun Court. That's right. So it's yeah.
Okay,
We had to
Sun Court.
clarify.
Okay, so Sun and Star Court, Sun Court, but it's where the basketball thing is, right beside City Hall. We're going to hopefully do an outside session there, and the weather will be good. Bill Jackson said he would look after the weather. So we'll have all of that, and we're hoping to have the flat screen there, and we'll have some work tables set up. So the land use planning will be the key part of that, but we'll have 4 other tables, one on housing, one on the transportation plan, and we'll have one on water. Chuck Williams has agreed to be part of that discussion, and hopefully Dana will be part of that discussion with our consortium and where they're going with the water analysis and water master plan. Pretty fundamental to land use planning too. So that's kind of the timetable and where we've been so far and where we're hoping to go. Obviously, that's guided by the county commission and the planning commission as far as advice is concerned. And we're trying to provide as many background documents and information and guidance as we can. Any questions about the timing or deliverables? Okay, there's another pregnant pause. I usually like 15 seconds. Bill Grimes, is that about copacetic or what? So
yeah, 15 seconds sounds about like the right degree for a pregnant pause. Where's that the question you were asking?
Yeah, it's 15 seconds. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to turn it over. If you're okay, Gabe, I'll turn it over to Bill and he'll carry the show.
Very good. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and try to share my PDF version of the PowerPoint here. Trusting you all can see that now since it's giving me the green light. So I will go through this rather quickly, anticipating that many of you either have had an opportunity to take a look at the narrated version of this or will soon. I think the value in our conversation today really is in what we discussed together. So I'd like to minimize the time that I have the floor exclusively. So John was talking about this various array of plans that the county is considering, sometimes in league with the city of Moab, sometimes on its own. And we wanted to use our time together to talk about land use, not only for the sake of land use, but also to maybe broaden your scope of review for these other plans to make sure that we're also considering the land use future and pattern and what that might imply in terms of transportation or economic development or neighborhood planning, whatever else may follow. Also, you're going to be looking at a new evolution of the general plan policy draft, and the conversation we have here about land use is really going to inform what's also happening with the other elements included within that general plan. And that general plan really is trying to look at a 20-year forecast. Some of it is spatial, some of it is not. Some of it is really related to budgetary investment moves and agreements that you have with your partners. But really what we're trying to do with the land use element is to make sure that we're dialing land use to be consistent with the 20-year vision for transportation, housing, economic development in your comprehensive plan, because they really do have a very close connection. And maybe in terms of the more immediate connection of the land use plan, we're looking at the need for updates to your zoning ordinance, and also making sure that the policies that you have in your general plan really are aligned with what is implied or explicitly stated in your land use plan. Also, you know, this land use plan is going to be putting together a larger framework within which your other plans, particularly your neighborhood or small area plans, are going to have to operate. And it's already showing up as a very useful tool, looking at level of service with, say, groundwater or other service providers in the county, so that their investments are consistent with the county's long range plan. Now, when we look at ways of preparing the land use plan, we often go about it in identifying what our long range vision is going to be, trying to identify a picture of what our county will be in 20 years, and then putting together a framework of goals and policies and implementation actions to go ahead and achieve it. It's a pretty linear process where we're clear where we are with point A, but we're also pretty clear on where it is that we want to be at point B.
Bill, did you want your slides to advance? Are you advancing?
I am. Are they not advancing on the
No.
presentation?
No.
Oh, well, that's weird.
Yeah.
It says I'm paused. Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Well, thank you. So thanks for pointing that out. I'll have to put it on my other screen. Ever since I had two monitors, my presentation world has turned sideways. Okay. So looking from point A to point B, that's what VisionBased Planning does for us. It also gives us the opportunity to see how we're going to make progress along that trajectory in 20-year increments. And frequently you'll see implementation actions align that way. What are we going to do between years 0 and 5? What are we going to do 6 through 10 and so on? And one of the things that this type of planning makes easy is really aligning all of your policies from your various elements. Everybody's agreeing on a consistent direction, so you can easily integrate your housing, economic development, transportation policies with your land use policies. But one of the things that vision-based planning assumes is that agencies have a good amount of control over their own ability to actually reach point B. And when we're looking at Grand County, that may or may not necessarily be the case. The area over which Grand County has land use jurisdiction is actually quite small, only 4% of the county area. So you are in a position where you are negotiating with your federal, state, and regional partners on much of your land use decision making. Also, a lot of the economic influences that spell prosperity or doom for Grand County are decided in areas outside of Grand County. And so a lot of these factors that we normally rely upon for guiding our hands in long range planning are really outside of your control, or you really don't have necessarily the degree of influence that some of this more conventional or vision-based planning might lead you to believe or to need. So if we're in a situation where we really do have that kind of limited control, what is our planning alternative and how do we approach it? Well, John and I were talking about this at the outset of the process, and he was believing that a scenario-based planning approach here really does make sense, given where the county is, and it still gives us a chance to align our policies, but it causes us to look a little bit differently at how we envision our future. So instead of necessarily imbuing ourselves with the power to influence the future we encounter, what we try to do here is we try to figure out what potential futures might be and then set ourselves up to really anticipate whatever surprises we may encounter. And it gives us that chance as we're looking at different scenarios to really define those different scenarios based on a set of variables that we think are beyond our control, but are also essentially important to the way our community is going to look and function. So if I needed to distill the difference between vision-based planning and scenario planning, I would say that scenario-based planning really focuses on conditions to which we must adapt, whereas vision-based planning is looking at the choices we make to attain the future we want. So when we think about it in terms of scenario, it gives us an opportunity to maybe take a step back and envision these different trajectories that the future may take us on. We don't necessarily know what's going to be happening with the cost of fuel, but we do understand that if it is more expensive to heat our homes or to move about the county, it's going to influence the way that we plan for our land development. So that gets us down to the set of variables that we use to help describe what each scenario actually might promise. And we have 10. And these 10 variables are derived from conversations that we've had over the last several months here with county residents and with stakeholders, so that we can take a look at these variables that really do matter to us. The first one on the list is the land values in Moab. You know, we've seen property values increasing rather dramatically here over the last 5 to 10 years, and so we're looking at relative increase in property values as something that may influence our future. We're also looking at fuel costs and see how those may increase or not increase so much over time, and how that might influence our future condition. We're also looking at the agricultural or resource-based economies, and if they begin to take on new prominence or if they continue to recede, what will our county look like in response to that? Similarly, the tourism economy and what's happening with second or third or fourth homes in Grand County, and what kind of pressures those might exert on our community fabric. Access to technology and reinvesting to make access to broadband a little bit more popular throughout the county area. Looking at mobility in two different ways, looking at mobility as a regional mobility question. What is the state going to be doing along Highway 191 to increase its capacity or not? And then on the more local side, what is Moab doing with its transportation network to increase capacity? I mean, we've heard about conversations about potential bypass in Moab. If something like that is constructed, what does that do to our land use framework, perhaps at the larger level? Water scarcity is another variable that we're looking at, as is vulnerability to climate change in the shape of extreme weather events. And what is that going to be looking like over the future? And then the last one is population. Do we look at a relatively consistent increase in population at about 0.5% per year? Or do we look at fluctuations in that rate of growth over time? And so as you can see, many of these factors really are beyond the county's control. You might have some capability to influence some of these things, but in large part, you're in a situation where if these variables change, the county needs to figure out a way to respond. One of the other things that came out of these earlier conversations is that whatever scenario we envision, there are some things that are immutable. There are things that are inviolable. We have to pay attention to at least the things that are included here on this slide. There are ecological and environmental conditions that are going to likely remain. And there are also some community-driven priorities that we want to make sure we embrace and enhance in whatever kind of a land use planning future we envision. We're not going to sacrifice those things that the community holds dear that we show here on this slide. So when we look at scenario A, this paints a picture where we see land values and fuel costs increasing rather significantly. We're also seeing increased investment in technology access, and we're also seeing increased prominence of water scarcity. Maybe water does become more scarce, or we're recognizing less of aquifer recharge potential or whatever, but water scarcity really is a front of mind consideration. We're seeing the agricultural and resource economy being relatively static in terms of its economic potency in the area, but we're also seeing a tempering influence on the second homes and tourism industry in scenario A. Scenario A is also talking about or predicting less investment in mobility. The state of Utah is saying, well, maybe Highway 191 isn't necessarily the priority for us. We've got other considerations and concerns that are more important. And the city of Moab is saying, we're not going to go ahead and invest much in freight or automotive capacity. We like our network the way that it is. We're seeing population is also a little bit tempered. We're not seeing the kind of growth that we may have experienced. Maybe it's like less than 5.5% per year. And we are seeing that extreme weather events tomorrow are pretty much the same as they are today. So if scenario A is the future that we encounter, then this is the type of a land use pattern that makes sense, given those considerations, where we see a consolidation of development in and around Moab. So it really does begin to centralize and consolidate land use development so that we're more resilient and less affected by increases in fuel or energy prices. This does result in increased housing costs, increased land in Moab, and it begins to take on a shape of really concentrating development. So we're building up in Moab and not necessarily out into Spanish Valley. Now, it does recognize that we have some entitled plats in Spanish Valley, and those would likely develop, but it really is putting the brakes on much beyond what is already in the pipeline. Now, if we envision a future that is more like scenario B, oh, I've got a question. Sarah. Yes, please.
Video because I'm not in my phone, but I just have a question. So when you talk about each of these different components, is it the component that's driving the plan, or does the plan facilitate like the change in or the value that you've assigned to each of those issues?
That's a great question, and it is the second. Well, what we're trying to do with scenario planning is to identify a potential future and then try to configure a land use or development pattern that is going to optimize our fit with that future. So it really takes planning and turns it a little bit on its head by showing how we can manage our land resource to best adapt to that alternative future we're imagining. And I would say, please feel free to interrupt. Raise your hand in this conversation. More than happy to answer questions as we go. If we're looking at scenario B, it's a slightly different mix of some of these variables where we see population really increasing, and we're also seeing a commensurate investment by the state of Utah in Highway 191 capacity. And some of the earlier conversations indicated that Highway 191 is a major alternate north-south freight route from New Mexico up towards Salt Lake City and points north. And so the state would be investing to increase that kind of mobility to accommodate. We're seeing land values and fuel costs not necessarily increasing at a terrible rate. It's something that's a little bit tempered. But in this scenario, we are seeing that the agricultural and resource-based economy is essentially tanking. We're not seeing much in the way of a lot of economic potency, either in the materials and minerals that we extract from the land or the stuff that we grow. So land values in the ag and resource space and the economic importance of the industry is really waning here. We are seeing our tourism industry relatively consistent. And we are seeing a moderate increase in our investment access to technology, but it's not really a high priority. Yes, Emily.
When we say ag resource economy, I know there's this sensitivity to all the federal lands around us where I don't imagine we'll see a change in some type of extraction or resource use, even if it's sustainable. So are we specifically talking about agricultural uses in the county-owned areas of Grand County, which is largely agricultural use in, Castle Valley and Spanish Valley is kind of what I have in mind. Is that what is the resource economy part of that we should be considering for county lands?
Yeah, good point. I think it's both local and maybe more global, okay. Where we understand that if our ag land economy is going to the point where the farms that we have today just can't make it anymore, that's usually going to be on private land. and that's going to be within the county's jurisdiction. I think also if our resource extraction economy begins to go down, that may influence the way that our public lands managers begin to look at the way that they're negotiating their leases. And it may shift a little bit what our economy looks like in maybe the county's more remote areas, as some of those lands that are maybe marginally viable or viable today become less so. Okay, so continuing on this, Moab doesn't necessarily increase in mobility along its main arterials. What the system is today, we basically see again tomorrow. Water scarcity becomes less of a problem, either because we're finding ways to develop new water resources, or we're implementing conservation programs that make it recede a little bit from popular concern. We're also seeing that extreme weather events maybe aren't as dire or drastic as have been forecast, and our population growth again is increasing. So that would be a scenario B kind of picture into the future. If we're experiencing, is there a question?
Oh, I just have a question with like, why was water scarcity highlighted as in scenario A as a giant issue, and then it drops in this scenario B with, is that just like the water related to agricultural use dropping off?
Well, that's a great point, and I think it points to the interrelationships between these different variables and how some might impact others. But yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, repurposing water that has been used for agricultural use, it might make more water available for culinary use or for domestic use. So that's a very real hydrogeological situation. But then maybe there are some policy issues that help address water scarcity, like a broadly applied conservation program where people just basically accept that water is a resource that we're managing, and now we can turn our attention to something else. Okay, another question.
Yeah, you know, it's an interesting thing, the water scarcity issue and ag, for some sense, when you have a scenario that favors agriculture, then you have water used in a funny way. That is that you have some resilience built in. If you have a water shortage for residents, it gives you something you could actually draw on. So this argument about water hardening. When you get rid of agriculture, you don't have this kind of reserve water that you might use for residents and businesses and stuff. Of course, you'd have to buy it and figure out how to get it. So it's an interesting thing, this kind of water scarcity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes. So if scenario B is one that is our future, then this becomes a land use plan that adapts to that type of a future, where we wind up seeing more conversion of what ag land already exists into non-agricultural uses, likely development. And we begin to see the emergence of these intersections of more concentrated development along the Highway 191 corridor between Moab and San Juan County. So what it does overall is that it perpetuates the development pattern that is taking root now, where we're seeing an increased sense of suburbanization along the Highway 191 corridor. And, you know, we have fuel prices at a lower level that enables folks to adapt to this kind of more dispersed development pattern. I see a hand still up. Is there another comment and question, or no? Okay. So if we look at scenario C as yet another test for our potential reality 20 years from now, we see population increasing, similar to the way it was with scenario B. We're seeing the land values in Moab holding relatively constant, maybe increasing with the pace of the regular market, not necessarily at the same rate that we've seen over the last decade. But we are also seeing increases in fuel costs. So it does become more expensive to run your car, truck, or heat your home. But in scenario C, the agricultural resource-based economy is finding new life. We're seeing new value on agricultural land and resource lands, generally because of economies and the forces outside of Grand County. It's still going to be an export-based economy, probably. Tourism economy and second homes continues to grow. This is a popular, beautiful place. More and more people want to be here. Technology is increasingly available to people, maybe to serve a lot of those second homes and tourists as they're coming here and working remotely. We're seeing moderate investments in mobility along Highway 191, so it's not as extravagant as maybe they were in scenario B. And then we're also seeing parallel investments in mobility in Moab. Water scarcity is increasingly important. We are seeing more and more extreme weather events due to climate change. So that would be scenario C, where we're really pretty much dialing up the intensity of all of these variables except for the land values in Moab. So the type of land use response to that condition is really more cellular, where we're looking at the development and the concentration of investment in these more clustered communities where people are able to adapt to higher fuel costs by living in closer proximity to the services that they need. And then we're also seeing this type of development pattern that begins to conserve culinary water because of the different residential types that would be included in this. Instead of a single family, more dispersed land use development pattern, we wind up seeing stuff where perhaps we have smaller or no yards and a development pattern that's more tightly defined. This also emphasizes the importance of maintaining and conserving the agricultural land or resource land in the county because it is an economic contributor as well as an aesthetic resource to the community. So we see this type of a more cellular development pattern that is growing up at these points that are perhaps a little bit more organic and centered around activity areas and also designed in ways that make water service easier to manage and perhaps more conserving. So I put a dot on Cisco because, well, why not? I don't know exactly how possible that's going to be. But when we look at Thompson Springs or we look at Green River, maybe there are opportunities to piggyback on some of that existing development, and then certainly around Castle Valley and on the 191 corridor between Moab and San Juan County. Also have an activity area around the airport if there is an opportunity for some activity to develop in that area, to probably locate it on some kind of employment based activity. Okay, Sarah, I see another question.
I'm just having a hard time understanding what those nodes are, because are you saying that those are commercial nodes, or are those farming nodes, or are they different? Like, can you describe the scenario a little bit better for me?
Sure. I see those nodes as urban nodes, villages, where we have opportunities for commercial service, employment, schools, housing, recreational open spaces like parks, but more urban in character. And the spaces between these villages or urban activity centers would be farmland or resource land or other open space areas that may just be too expensive to serve with water or other development services. Does that help you?
I guess it's just that those nodes are very different, like the Castle Valley versus like the airport. Nobody, I was just wondering if a blanket prescription for each node or.
Oh, sure. I mean, I could go through this. I'll avoid Cisco because I can't even understand it the way that it is. I can't think about predicting the way it might be in 20 years. But Thompson Springs, we've had conversations with people who see Thompson Springs as a realistic residential alternative for people who are living in Moab but can't afford to be there. And so we could see increasing residential development pressure in Thompson Springs that would drive an increased commercial school or services presence, and maybe even secondary employment at a small scale in Thompson Springs. So that is the type of character that I was thinking about for Thompson Springs. Green River, it would feel like the satellite of Green River, where maybe it's a smaller suburban residential type of community, but would have small scale commercial services to augment what might be available in Green River, serving these people and maybe within a walk of where it is that they live. The node around the airport, as I was mentioning earlier, would be focused around airport activity and likely employment at the airport. I'm not sure yet what the economic development strategy is going to indicate for this particular facility, but I put a dot there because there might be some opportunities for intensification to happen there. It'll probably be less focused on residential and more focused on land intensive industrial manufacturing or warehousing. The areas in Moab, they're north of town. It would really build on what is existing there, not far from the Arches Gateway, where we're seeing resort, residential, hospitality uses congregating in that space and maybe becoming more intense. And there may be some residential development there, but that focus is pretty much going to be building off of access to Arches and other recreational areas to the north and west. And then Moab, of course, would continue being Moab. It would just be more intensely developed. Probably see introduction of new housing types, maybe more stacked flats, garden apartments, townhomes, to take advantage of the increased focus in developing centrally to Moab. And then the dots in Spanish Valley are really taking advantage of major access points off of Highway 91 into the developable lands on either side of Highway 91, whether on the east, Spanish Valley Road, or whether it's to the west in some of the areas that are, well, in some cases defined by SITLA ownership and just taking shape now from a development context, but still having opportunities for these centralized development spaces where you have a lot of your daily needs offered within, say, a 10-minute walk of that intersection with Highway 191. So you'd see a variety of residential types, probably with more dispersed single family on the periphery of those nodes, but then building up and becoming more intense as you got closer to the highway. And then right along the highway edge, it would really have more of a commercial or professional office emphasis. So I hope that helps. You know, the southernmost node is similar to, in character, is similar to something that San Juan County had been working with SITLA on envisioning, and I'm just now breaking into that plan, but it looks like it is almost a fully contained community in the northern edge of San Juan County. It's not necessarily designed to compete with Moab, but certainly becomes an affordable alternative to Moab for people who are interested in working in Spanish Valley or in the city. So I hope that helps with the characterization that I was envisioning, and it actually gets back to an earlier question you made. You know, what comes first, the kind of community that you want to have, or the type of future scenario that you're likely to expect, and I think that's really the crux of where we take this. You know, where we acknowledge that there are things beyond our control to influence. But there are still things we want to achieve that incorporate our values and priorities. And so where do we find the power that we can to move toward what we want, recognizing we're going to have to adapt to surprises down the road. That's actually a great segue to this next slide, where we're trying to figure out how we can manage that tension. And you know, some of these land use plans may seem more attractive to you than others. Some of these priorities embedded in these plans may really resonate with you, but they don't necessarily match up with the type of future that you foresee. So what I'm hoping we can do, and not necessarily today, but over the next several days anyway, as you consider the exercise, is think about ways that we can position ourselves to adapt to attaining the future that we like, but also remain adaptable and flexible so that we can still head in that direction, even if we encounter something that we don't expect. So what we're trying to do with the exercise is to really give you a vehicle to explore those things. Is how we can start thinking about what these different scenarios mean to what we really hold most dear and cherish about Grand County, and how we can start to think about articulating those preferences so that when we're looking at our policies over the next 20 years, land use, and also in your comprehensive plan, your strategic plan, your economic development plan, that we're honoring those things that are really most important. The joy about strategic planning is that because it presumes that the future will likely be different than the one that we would envision on our own, that we place emphasis on what it is that we're going to be doing over the next 5 years. So regardless of whether we're on track to reach point B, point B2, or point B3, the time between point A and the next 5 years really clusters the type of future we're likely to experience. And so if we focus on our actions to address that spread of futures in the first 5 years, we have a pretty good basis upon which to act and prioritize what it is we do right now. What scenario planning does ask you to do is to check back. And after 5 years, take a look at your plan and see how well it predicted these scenarios, and take another look at what you're going to do for the next 5 years. Now, I don't know if you've had a chance yet to take a look at this exercise, but what we're hoping to be able to do today is to help you feel comfortable about approaching this exercise. Work through some of the questions and concerns you might have about it, and then just turn you loose on it, so that you have an opportunity to think about this thing, jot down your thoughts, and get them back to John. We're going to be having a public workshop on the 3rd, and we really we're going to be using this worksheet as the basis for that workshop. But we need to have some better information, I think, before we get into that public conversation. And so we've invited various stakeholders and steering committee members to take a look at this exercise and weigh in. A lot of this is somewhat technical. We got a comment back from Dana at Grand Water, and it was really informative. And so we need to understand what it means for these various service providers and what is really implied in these different scenarios. And we think that planning commissioners and county commissioners are going to have that same type of an insight on what the different implications might be. So that as people are asking us questions about these scenarios, we have an opportunity to answer them from a more informed perspective. So what this exercise does is that it asks you to consider the 3 scenarios, and then to think about which scenario you believe is the best fit for Grand County's future. What is your impression on where Grand County is going to be? And implied with it is a preferred land use course that goes along with that scenario. Now, the subsequent questions here ask you to modify, because as you're looking at these preferences, you're probably going to think, yes, it's on target here and here, but maybe not so much there. And so these subsequent questions give you a chance to enumerate some of those differences, and to clue us into some of the nuance that's underpinning your thinking and some of your impressions. The let's evaluate columns that you see there ask you to take a look at how well each of the 3 scenarios performs in addressing these value-based criteria. We want a community that's economically vital. Which scenario sets us up best for that? So I know that these kinds of exercises can seem a little bit esoteric and abstract. And so what I've done here is I've put a consultant's take in the column 2, or in the column also, so you can take a look at some of what's on our minds as we look at comparing the various scenarios and how they perform for those 9, I think it is, criteria. And on the backside of the worksheet is just another sketch of each of the scenarios, along with a little bit of our thinking about what the various advantages, drawbacks, and implications might be for each one. So as I said before, we're hoping that we'll have an opportunity to talk about this exercise and this overall scenario concept here this afternoon with you, so that you feel comfortable with this worksheet. And then on March 3rd, we're going to convene with the public outside of Sun or Starcourt or whatever the heck it's named for a conversation. Okay. Yes, Kevin.
So I guess this might be a version of a question Sarah asked, but I'm in the scenarios you're presenting, you know, the maps show some pattern of development, but then you've also got this, you know, 8 different variables about, you know, fuel prices and extreme weather events and population and things like that. And the latter are kind of a mixture of things that we don't have much control over and things we do have a lot of control over. For example, you know, rate of population growth, you know, that kind of responds to zoning to some extent. So in rating these, are we just rating the maps, what we think, or I guess you emphasized before the interplay between factors we have some control over and things we have less control over. How does that relate to us saying how much we like different things?
Mm-hmm. I would suggest taking it in steps. And I would first look at the variable array for each of the 3 scenarios and reflect on this and think about which one you believe is most likely for Grand County's future. And then, you know, it's imagination. It's not at all something that we can say is right or wrong at this point. We're just trying to really take the temperature of what people are envisioning in terms of conditions for Grand County. And then the second step would be to take a look at the land use scenario that matches up with that. Okay, so we have a set of conditions, and then there's a likely land use development response. The third step is to take a look at that land use response and see if that just makes sense to you. See if that's something that really does fit with the way you perceive Grand County ought to develop over the next 20 years. Now, if you believe that there is a fairly significant gap between the land use scenario that you would prefer and the type of future that you think is most likely, which is possible, then that becomes a prescription for more aggressive policy intervention. So that despite whatever is happening here in the conditions side, and you want to achieve a scenario that doesn't necessarily match up with those conditions, the county has to become more active on the policy side to attain that future. Now, that's one of those things that we're going to take a look at after we get a chance to understand more about how people are reconciling these 2 things. But we don't want to come out of the gate right away and say, hey, we need to manage our growth scenarios or our land use development policy to attain this future without having a better understanding of how that type of a land use future might relate to a likely future condition. Does that make sense?
Sorry, my internet cut out for a few seconds, so I missed the last 20 seconds of what you said.
Okay. Well, I was just talking about one of the things that will flow from this exercise is a greater understanding for us how aggressive the policy position for the county might need to be to attain a desirable land use plan that doesn't necessarily match up with an envisioned future scenario.
Okay, so to make sure I understand it, so part of the exercise is to say which of these predictions of the future do we think is most realistic. Part of it is to say, you know, do we like the way that the county looks, you know, in 10 or 20 years in these 3 different options. And then the one I'm less sure about is like if there's a a future that we kind of really don't like, but we think it's a good response to the assumptions we've made about fuel prices and extreme weather or whatever, that's not part of the exercise. We say we don't like it, even though it's probably the best option given.
Yeah, as you work through this, you're probably going to recognize exactly that, and you will have opportunities to say, yeah, this scenario seems to meet the prerequisites offered by these conditions, but it kind of sucks. And these are the ways that I think we need to make it better. And so what'll happen is that we're going to get a picture of maybe that gap between what people predict and what people want. And we have to navigate that difference with our land use policy. And we're not asking you necessarily to take that step yet, but we are asking you to acknowledge the degree of alignment between the future you predict and the future you want. So does that help you?
Yeah, that helps some.
Yes, sir. Another question.
Not a question, just a comment. That's actually very helpful because I think when I read over the material, I thought what was really happening was we were to kind of think about which one of these three we liked. Oh, well, maybe you'd take A and C and different parts of them. So this is different than I thought we would try to do. And I guess the question is, what will we try to do today? And you may tell us many things, that is, predict what's likely to happen. Do we go as far as then say, well, I don't like that or this of what we think is going to happen, so start worrying about policies that would change that. I'm not sure where we go today with the exercise, but you'll probably tell us.
Right. Today with the exercise, I would say work individually on it. I don't think we're going to try to get a collective picture among everybody here attending on what the most likely future is. I think everybody might have a slightly different take on it. And this exercise is designed to explore those slightly different takes. So yeah, I think that's the direction there. When we were looking at this joint meeting and wanting to figure out how to best propel all of us from it to tomorrow, is so that everybody here does feel empowered to undertake this exercise and to really give it some of that reflective thought that it asks of you. And that you also feel comfortable about talking to other people in your circles and in your networks who might be inclined to participate in this too, and alert them to this exercise, be able to help them when they come to you with questions about it, and then also promote attending the workshop on the 3rd. All right. Anybody else have questions or thoughts? Anybody feeling a little unsure about how to approach this exercise?
I think the level of comfort might be that you can work through this on your own. It is homework, and I don't know how many people have actually gone through it. But the goal would be, as Bill says, is develop a bit of familiarity so you'd be able to discuss this with within your circle, and then to articulate some of that on March the 3rd. That's kind of a goal for us, is to get that far. You're the major decision makers in the county, and you're very vital to that process. And thinking through, as Kevin was hitting on and Sarah was hitting on, I think Obi is as well, is the dynamic between the conditions and how those would play out, with the caveat that it has to be real. It has to be something that is going to happen. You need to condition your hopes and your dreams. It's a form of general planning. General planning is more of a hope and dream kind of thing. This is conditioning that to a point where And I don't know if you think this is impossible, where the majority of the people at the table today can agree. No level of comfort there. I don't see Kevin smiling. There he is.
So we're to look at the 3 scenarios, correct? And not so much from the angle of what we want to happen, but what we predict is more likely to happen, and see which scenario we feel is the most likely, or if there's sections of each scenario that we consider more likely, and then be able to discuss that. Is that our homework?
That's a great synopsis. Yes, look at the scenarios. Gauge which one you think of those 3 best represents the future in Grand County 20 years from now. And then compare that to the land use scenario that matches up to it. You might not be comfortable with that matching up. And so we'll be asking you to take a look at that land use scenario and figure out how it might need to adjust to better suit what it is you're hoping for.
I get confused on a few points, like the tourism economy second home piece, where, like, who knows? It's all up to how we make some zoning choices. But yeah, I guess I get confused about that, the whole premise of this then, because some of these things we have a lot of choice over in creating a land use code that shapes what we want to see.
There are some things there over which you do have more control. You may not necessarily have control over the pressure behind, and there may be pressures impacting the second home or tourism economy that are defined outside of your sphere of control, and will find their way to influence what's going on in Grand County. You may wind up electing a new slate of commissioners. Don't know.
Right. I have a quick question on scenario A, Moab and its fringe conditions. Why is Moab mobility so low?
In scenario A,
Yeah. I mean, I would think if we put all of our effort into city planning and walkability, and there's a bunch of apartment complexes, that mobility within Moab might actually be higher with more public transit or whatever.
yeah, thank you for the question, and maybe I didn't define it clearly enough. Mobility, I was really looking at highway and roadway capacity. So in what you just described, individual mobility of a human, on foot, on a bike, and a bus, may not necessarily be impaired, maybe even enhanced, but freight mobility would be diminished in scenario A. So we're not necessarily looking at adding a lane or major improvements to Highway 191, and the question of a bypass is completely off the table for Moab.
Doc's got a question there, Bill.
Yeah, I think it would help me. How exactly is this exercise going to help shape the general plan?
Well, I'll kick off, and then I'll hand it to John. Our role really is land use plan, but we're also defining instruments to help John build a nexus between the land use plan and other elements of the general plan. The planning horizon is similar, right? I mean, we're still looking at 20 years out. That's going to be consistent with the general plan. But what we're hoping to be able to do is to identify specific land use policies that are consistent with this desired direction for a land use plan. And it's going to have a direct impact on level of service. And so that's going to have an immediate informative effect on the general plan, where it is looking at level of service in a little bit more detail. We've also built something that we call a policy framework based on John's early draft of the general plan that breaks down each of the elements into their component goals, policies, and action items. And so it's a tool to help John navigate internal consistency among the general plan, but it also gives us an opportunity to hang land use policies on relevant policies in the rest of the general plan. So hopefully the direct relationship between the land use plan and level of service and that connecting armature between the policy frameworks will make sure that we have this kind of consistency and interdependence.
Yeah, Jacques, if you've read, I'm sure you've read through the whole draft general plan, all 150 pages, and there's a lot of policies in there, a lot of goals that are not connected, as Bill just said. In a good comprehensive plan, which is what the general plan is, all of those pieces work together. Social planning, environmental planning, economic planning. The land use plan was always considered the backbone of any general plan. If you go back 40 years, that's all the general plan was the land use plan. And so it's one of those elements that connects so many other pieces. Infrastructure is a big part of that. Levels of service, you can do a level of service analysis and mapping and show where your current levels of service are high. We've charted this out in the plan so far. A level of service 1 is all services. Level of service 2 is just water and roads. And level of service 3 is rural. That's a basic kind of chart of that. So what we would like to do is flesh that out when the land use plan's done. And then as well, at the same time, you haven't asked this question, but I think Kevin would ask this question. At the same time, connect the land use code to the general plan so that those pieces work together. It takes some time to get there. I know there's a fair bit of frustration around getting housing going, and there's some reactions we can make, but the goal in this plan, midterm plan, is to get the general plan coordinated with the land use code so their development regulations support the policy areas. I'm probably saying a lot of rhetoric here that doesn't make a lot of sense to you, but the goal is to have those pieces working together, as Bill just said. In the general plan, they're not now. They're not working together. They're not only internally inconsistent, they're externally inconsistent. They're externally inconsistent with the zoning codes and regulations, and they're externally consistent to other things like social planning, environmental planning, economic planning. So there's a lot of gaps there, and that's not unusual in this process. So it should start to make more sense to you when we start getting into that internal implementation strategy, which is going to you're going to come to see too, and how these pieces work together. Transportation master plan will be connected to the land use plan, which will connect to the infrastructure plan, and the social, environmental, and economic as well. So that's a functional plan. Right now, we don't have one.
I love this stuff. I could talk about it for days. But just can't do that anymore. Like,
Bill, one of the things I was egging Bill on to do, which he said, I'm not going to do that, was to demonstrate what Dana did. And Dana did an analysis and she had a fair bit of insight, I thought, which would help and model some of this. So we hesitated doing that because we want to make this open-ended for each one of you now, so that you're not prejudging it. And I know all of you operate fairly independently as well as cohesively. So, but we hesitated bringing a model in. We thought we'd just leave it with you to develop that yourself.
Yeah, Dana basically pointed out that our habits and the easy thing for us to do would lead us in one direction, but what she was thinking would actually be wisest to do leads us in another. And it was interesting to see that coming from Grand Water's perspective. When is homework due? I would say a week before March 3rd. So what does that put us on? Next Wednesday would be great. And Kevin, you have a hand up?
Yeah, this may hopefully my last question on what exactly we're intended to do in the exercise. But I was looking at the consultants' take answers that you had there. And for environmental sensitivity, you rank scenario B kind of low. And that puzzled me a little bit because it seems like that has, less development than alternative C, and they seem kind of the same as Spanish Valley. So which makes me think maybe I was misunderstanding something about the relation. So why was that your take there?
Because of the consumption of open space in Spanish Valley was really the big one there, and also the dispersal of the infrastructure system to serve more dispersed development patterns.
Okay, so alternative B, there's less open space in Spanish Valley, and alternative C, we've got more open space, but more development in places like Thompson and Green River. Is that the idea?
Right. Yeah, and the development that occurs is really more compact in form.
Yeah.
You know, it's something that is a combination of market response and policy response to those conditions. In some cases, the market alone is going to dictate a pattern. In other cases, it might take a little bit more policy push to get there. And I think in scenario C, it's a combination both of market and policy to attain that type of a condition.
Yeah, because I guess my take, and again, looking at the maps, maybe I didn't study the narrative closely enough, but an issue that often gets brought up around here is that people like the sort of open, undeveloped nature of Grand County, and I think that usually that means places like North 191, pretty much everything except Spanish Valley, and so scenarios where we have little hamlets cropping up all over the place. To me, that feels like a big important loss of open space, whereas a few less alfalfa fields in Spanish Valley, not so much. That is also something, but it just seems like smaller scale. So,
right. And I think that's important nuance to bring out in your responses on this. So without that kind of response, I don't know that we would necessarily consider it as part of the process. So it's good. It's good for us to see.
Okay, thanks.
Emily?
First of all, I'm sorry I had to drop out for a moment, so I hope that these questions haven't been asked. I mean, one that comes to mind, just given the fact that this is a responsive exercise to what we anticipate we will be responding to versus a vision exercise, there's a degree of, making those constraints work for us. How would you guide us to be thinking about the effects this could have on development in surrounding communities? And, to what extent should that weigh in? For example, I look at scenario A and think, well, that's likely to drive development to to North San Juan County and into South Spanish Valley, which, could have pretty grievant ecological effects, for example. Like how would you guide us to be considering those trade-offs, given the fact that we are blind to what reality will be 20 years from now?
Right. I think my refuge with this would be to look at it as regional influences that are going to be equally experienced among Grand County, the northern portion of San Juan County, and maybe even as far north as up in Green River and up on the reservation. So I mean, I think we have to look at that from a regional standpoint and not just a local one. And so, it may have an influence to drive development elsewhere if Grand County were unique in experiencing this, but I think we have to maybe take a step back.
Okay.
And when we're talking about Moab, it is the regional place, for hundreds of miles. So, I think it's okay for us to say Moab land values and use that as a metric, because that will be our primary point of identity focus, most likely 20 years.
And I actually think I'm going to hold my other question because I think you probably answered it earlier. So this is helpful. Thanks, Bill.
Okay. Please feel free to reach out to John and to me too as you're working through this, because the more feedback we get from you as you're going through this, I think the better we're able to facilitate the exercise on the third. So please consider this an active assignment.
Okay, Bill, if you don't mind, and this might, I think we got a bit of time here. I wouldn't mind doing a quick roundtable because sometimes people are quiet and you have to put them on the spot, those. So if you don't mind, I'll just go to Gabe first. Any comments or suggestions, Gabe?
I get, yeah, without sort of jumping into the exercise and sort of what I've started doing and looking at it, I guess I don't have any further ways of framing it for anyone else or sort of comments or influence that I want to, impose. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks. Mary? You're
Unmute. Unmute. Okay, unmute. I'm going to ask for help. I'm a little at loss as to where to start. I see the big picture, but I'm having a hard time drilling down into the details. And so I will be reaching out to the planning department and or the planning commission and setting up a meeting where I can sit down and you can, help me get started. I think once I get started, I won't feel so lost. So
sure. Yeah,
that's,
we're there to help. Yeah.
I'm going to be reaching out. Thank
Okay,
you.
that's great. Anyone else can do that too, as Bill mentioned, and you can invite the public. As I said, I don't know if I mentioned this, but we sent it out to over 100 stakeholders, including our client engagement group as well. So yeah, anyone you want to engage in your circle, or then normally that would be public, I'm guessing. So, or any stakeholder you can think of that's helpful, builders, developers, anyone like that.
Yes, and to further answer that question, yes, Emily, I would certainly welcome public participation in this. I'm hoping to be able to get as much of this homework done from our steering committee and commission members before the March 3rd meeting, so that we can anticipate some of the questions that are to come up on the 3rd, and that will, I think, help us message a more public broadcast of the worksheet at that.
Yep. So you want to involve your kids, family, pets. Okay, Jacques.
I think I have a pretty good idea of what is going on. Logistically, do we turn the homework into you, John, or how?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Gathered.
Yeah. Yeah, me or Bill, but I'm probably the easiest for you to get to.
I would say get it to John, and then John will bundle them and hand them to me.
Yeah.
And then at the meeting on March 3rd, will we get a kind of an overview of how most of us answered, or like just a synopsis of where everyone's at?
Well, I was hoping that we would do that debrief later, actually, after the public session. Yeah. Bill?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, we'll have that information, and if you'd like to know, we're more than happy to share it. But we want to let the public have a shot at it without necessarily,
right, coloring their view. Sure.
Yeah. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but the types of responses that we get from you will help us represent this exercise to the public. It will be very, very valuable.
Okay, Kevin? Is he still there?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't think you were going to call me because I already talked.
Oh, yeah.
I think I've got as good, my other questions got answered, so I'm fine.
Okay, Trish. Trish has been quiet. It's a little unusual, Trish.
I know. I've been talking a lot today already. So I've run out of steam.
You have, okay.
Not good. No, I know how to do homework. I appreciate that word, so I'm on it. It's on my list of things to do tomorrow, but I'll let you know if I have questions.
Okay, that'd be great. Evan.
Yeah, I guess I'm feeling a bit of kind of paralysis by analysis. I think that I was looking forward to kind of like rolling up the sleeves and getting our hands dirty today. And while this whole group was together with these two separate bodies, and I think that both these bodies kind of together and individually have identified a lot of kind of short-term needs that are really pressing. You know, we have applications coming before us now that we're kind of basically denying because we don't have these things in place. And I think that there's a lot of kind of things we've already identified and are eager to get going on. And so it still kind of feels like we're looking at this from 10,000 feet and not really close to getting down to the nitty gritty of like rolling out a map and looking at individual boundary lines and where these things are going to be. And so I guess that's just kind of where I'm at with kind of hearing things today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can do that on your own though, Evan. You can do a map and we can help you with that and put where you think the growth should occur and then flip that and put it into constraints.
Yeah, I think that there's other, you know, I think these two bodies together are pretty familiar with a lot of like, you know, I'm thinking specifically about, we had an application come up for a commercial rezone in a pretty urban area, and the neighbors, you know, it was just kind of big jump from highway commercial to residential. And it was like, hey, let's come up with some buffer zones. We've had a lot of interest in building higher density sort of apartment sort of buildings, and we don't have any kind of ability to approve that because it doesn't exist in the zoning now. And it seems like there's some low hanging fruit that we could be kind of ticking off, whether it's simultaneously or whatever, but it just kind of feels like kicking the can down the road. So I guess I look forward to this moving forward and us getting closer to actual action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, John, I know that Melissa's working on some specific zone change text amendments right now that I think might help address some of these things, and we're coordinating so that as this land use policy is taking shape, it's also informing what Lisa is doing. So I think that there's stuff that's happening along with this. I'm hoping that this gives us an opportunity to anticipate some other changes, maybe even beyond what's on the radar now, so that we can be proactive in looking at land use policy and anticipate some of these things that are coming down the road. And not at the expense of putting things off that we know we need to take care of now.
Great.
I don't want to speak for you, John, but I mean, just looking at the way you're moving both things on a parallel track, I think that's important.
Yeah. Okay. I know we're not answering Evan's concerns directly, but we'll get there, Evan. You just have trust, have faith. I know you want it sooner, and we're hopefully going to align these things together as it moves ahead. The tweaks that are coming on the land use code, we're going with this steering committee next week with a prioritization process with that steering committee too. So you'll be hearing a lot more about this within a reasonable length of time. Hopefully that's not too frustrating for you. Okay, Sarah?
Pass.
You pass? Okay. So, Obi?
Yeah, it sounds like there's pieces of the homework that are open-ended. I know we're going to probably go through rating these three different scenarios on these different, water consumption and housing affordability, et cetera. But it also sounds like we have kind of open-ended stuff. For instance, we might want to combine more than just the three scenarios. I'm just going to say, what if I said Cisco, they don't have the water. Thompson might have the water. I'll get rid of the dot for Cisco. What are the probabilities of finding land that you could develop at the base of Castle Valley, given land ownership at this point? And combining things like, I'll just make it up, a more urban growth boundary kind of argument for Moab, but some outlying development in nodes. So if I understand correctly, in some kind of narrative, we can kind of use our thoughts that there might be another scenario. Is that roughly right?
You're throwing in some Oregon planning there with growth boundaries.
You know, I've thought about that a lot, but of course, it's not the same situation. They got these urban growth boundaries in before you had lots of development in all the rural land, right? And of course, it's lush and green and all of it can be farmland. So I shouldn't probably have said urban growth boundaries, but you know what I was thinking.
Yeah. I think a lot of people know what you're thinking. Okay, I think that was the round table. I think Makeda disappeared.
I'm so sorry, I don't want to have
forgot
the last
Emily.
word. I do want to suggest one thing.
Oh, sorry.
I'd really love if we could get the facilitated video and a copy of this worksheet up on Grand County Connect so that we can point people there.
Aren't they there?
I'm looking and I'm not seeing it. So if it's
Oh.
not on the homepage, maybe we can get it on the homepage or, you know, the main page so we can direct people there.
Yeah.
I just recall a few years ago, we had a active planning, you know, we had a number of town halls, and one of the things that stood out in my mind was a comment that we're very good here about talking about what we don't want to see in Grand County. There's not as much engagement at the citizen level about what we want Grand County to look like 20 years down the road and in a strategic sense. And I'm really glad to see this exercise be a bit of a forcing function to start to get that from citizens, and the more involvement we can get, the better. So I'd love to push that and push visibility of that as well.
Sorry, Emily, I forgot you. I left you till last. Sorry.
You know what? It's, you know, it's all good. I'm just taking up the rear.
Yeah.
Thank you for
So
letting me get my
Makeda-
words in.
no, that's great. That should have all been on Grand County Connects. I thought it was. I didn't look though. And Makeda looks like she was on and then left. I'm guessing, huh?
Steve and
No.
Makeda had to drop for work commitments.
Yeah. Okay. So that's all a wrap. Bill, do you have any follow-up comments?
I'm really looking forward to seeing you when I come into town. I'll be in Moab for about 5 days, 4 or 5 days. So I hope somewhere among those days we'll have an opportunity to connect. And definitely the afternoon and early evening of the 3rd.
Yeah. Okay, well, with that, we're looking forward to your responses, and we're here as a resource. The whole department is, our little department. Jenna is, Lisa is, I am, Laura is, and Josh too. So we're looking forward to your and it can come from anybody, Chris, Mallory, Quinn as well. So looking forward to getting some feedback internally too. We'll bring this up with our stakeholders or our internal group on Friday as well as part of the workshop. So that's Gabe, that's pretty well it as far as the workshop's concerned. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Bill and John and the rest of the planning and zoning staff. Thanks to the planning commissioners for jumping on with us. And yeah, this is very, very interesting stuff. And we will adjourn this meeting now at 3:25 and see the rest of the county commissioners at 4 for Thompson.
Thanks all.
Thank you very much.